You're hitting the nail on the head. This was not about antitrust going in. I think people were, kind of confused. Even Jim Jordan, I don't think he has any clue what he's talking about. He doesn't know the difference between regulation and antitrust. He doesn't know the difference between the Sherman Act and Section 230. I think they're all kind of making it up as they go along. So in many ways, I think personally that the companies that were the most at risk going in were the same companies at risk coming out. And so, if you had to stack rank the risk, I think Facebook is number one at the top of the list. Then I think it's Google. Then I think it's Apple. And then I think far, far, far down is Amazon. In many ways, Amazon is the most inoculated simply because the end market that they operate in is so massive. And the market that Facebook operates in is so new, yet so constrained with very few competitors. So in many ways, I think that's how the risk cuts. I really think that the antitrust legislative framework that exists today isn't enough to touch any of these guys. Instead, I think what really happens is more regulatory. And if you really think about what these guys are very concerned about, it's more that Facebook largely, and then Google to a smaller degree, essentially can be kingmakers with respect to popular opinion and sentiment. And I think that they want to have regulations. And I think that there's a good historical precedent for a bunch of industries that have had to come under regulation when they effectively get to 100% distribution. Whether it's meat or airplanes or radio or television, agriculture writ large, automobiles and transportation, whenever a market basically serves 100% of the total addressable universe, governments step in and they don't necessarily legislate and trust bust. They fundamentally regulate and tax. And I think in many ways that's just as bad. And frankly, in some ways it's worse. Because if you do that to a tech company, you're basically crippling the one thing that they're supposed to be very good at, which is to innovate. And that's the only thing that they can use to basically keep their stock price high, which is then the only thing that they can use to get people to continue to work for them. So that's the sort of circular loop that breaks if you regulate them. And I think that the risk coming in was the same as coming out.
So Facebook, let's take them one at a time. Facebook, I thought, had the worst performance because it was pretty clear that Nadler was setting them up not only to not be able to buy a company in the future, but in that clip, he was sort of teeing them up that maybe the Instagram acquisition should be unwound and they should be forced to spin that off because they were saying over and over and over again that Zuckerberg put in emails with his management team that they were going to buy these companies or kill them or copy their feature sets. And even though that may not be explicitly illegal, the fact that they've hit, as Chamath is talking about, such incredible market share with billions of users, and because of the track record of Zuckerberg, which may not be at all related to this, but it sets the table.
No, but Jason, in fairness to Mark, that decision wasn't made when Facebook had market dominance. That decision was made when Facebook was still fundamentally at risk, and there was a large period of time where a lot of other people, had they been left to their own devices or properly capitalized, could have actually become a relatively important competitor to Facebook.
Instagram could have been at that point, but then Snapchat was the opposite. Snapchat, they were at scale, and then they were going to buy it and threaten them, either you sell to us or we're going to copy the features.
I think what a more logical and defensible reaction, I just think it's not defensible to say, oh, you know what, Facebook, I didn't like the acquisition you did 10 years ago, basically because it worked.
Yes.
And so I'm going to punish you 10 years later. That's crazy. That's stupid.
Yeah. In the rearview mirror, no good. Yeah.
A more reasonable place to be is to say, okay, this thing, meaning communications writ large, has become a critical piece of societal infrastructure. And we are trying to figure out now what the rules should be. And rules shouldn't be brittle. Rules should be evolutionary. They should map, to the moral decisions and ideas and frameworks of the time. And so, we have to figure out, for example, number one, interoperability. So how can you message across all these multiple networks? Another simple example, we legislated the ability for emergency services to be able to send a message on your mobile phone line and your landline. You should probably be able to have a backdoor into all the messaging networks simply for that reason. So the point is that, there are all kinds of things you can do today to make this infrastructure layer of society operate in a more predictable way on behalf of.
What was your best? Have you thought about a regulation? Then let's stick to Facebook, and then we'll go to Amazon. Chamath, have you thought about a regulation that would make sense to Facebook, whether it's divesting an asset or maybe a certain percentage of usage, or allowing Facebook Messenger to work with iMessenger to work with, Twitter DMs?
I'll answer it in a different way. So look, I mean, for 20 years, I've run these kind of businesses, like from Winamp to AIM and ICQ to then, at Facebook. And so, I remember at AIM and ICQ, we, did all this hand wringing and all these meetings between us and Microsoft and Yahoo to make our messaging networks interoperate. And, eventually we were basically just cut off at the knees because other people just moved around us. And eventually it all just morphed anyways away from these sort of brittle messaging networks. My kind of view is that I think what's best for Facebook is the status quo. And so, if they can basically, and by the way, I think the strategy is, and Mark wrote this in his manifesto, but a couple of years ago, this is sort of what led to Chris Cox resigning. If I'm playing, sort of like conspiracy theorist, if you read Zuck's manifesto, what he was basically saying is, listen, we're going to take all these product and we're going to take all that code and we're going to mesh them all together in such a complicated, convoluted mess that if and when somebody ever tells us to rip it apart, it'll take another 5 or 10 years to do it. And that's effectively the technical read on that manifesto. It's just like, you're going to make it technically impossible to unthread these things as independent entities.
And your thesis is that's a strategy against an antitrust breakup. I find that...
No, I just think it's a really smart strategy. I mean, he wrote it and he published it online, so it's not like he's hiding anything. He made it. Right. I mean, this is the beautiful part about it. He made it completely in the clear. Now, so that's the strategy, is to basically make it one monolithic code base, so that if and when, I'm not sure if this is the intention, but frankly, if and when somebody knocked on the door and said, hey, you need to strip apart WhatsApp and Messenger and Instagram, you can say, well, look, it's one monolithic code base of 50 million lines of code. It'll take me 10 years, but sure, I'll figure it out somehow. So I think what's good for Facebook is a status quo. Now that's different from what's good for politicians, and then what's different for consumers. I think what's good for consumers is fundamental interoperability. Now this is then what touches Android and Apple as well. Like the idea today that you cannot have a group text message that can only include iPhones, on the off chance one of your friends has an Android phone, you're basically fucked. Is kind of
which
crazy,
happens every 6 months on our group. That Friedberg, what do you think in terms of Facebook and any potential action that could be taken, or any possible solution to them having such a dominant position? Because they are the only one of the four that has a dominant position.
I would think about the, how these businesses are kind of built, right? There, in all these businesses, there's an infrastructure layer. The infrastructure layer, in the case of Google and Facebook, is reasonably similar. It's a bunch of data centers and hardware and software infrastructure to run all of their services on top. And then on top, there are consumer products. And then there are advertising products, and the customer base for the consumer product is obviously users, and the customer base for the advertising products is these advertisers that pay to access these consumers and give them ads and get clicks from them and sell them stuff. And so if you think about what do you pull out, it sounds like on the Google side there's concern both on the advertising and on the consumer products that are being offered, and the scale and the leverage that Google has and how they make those products kind of come to market. And with Facebook, it's really about this absolute kind of monopoly on social products and services, whereas Google's got this great monopoly on search products for consumers. So you could kind of take a layman's view and say, hey, like rip out WhatsApp and rip out Instagram. And, then Facebook is good. But the problem is in that infrastructure layer, they've created this social graph and this connection between, all the people that and they've got all the stuff sitting on the same servers. And Chamath points out all the same code base, and there's a lot of commonality there. So the reality of like ripping something out from there is a lot more nuanced and a lot more challenging than just saying, hey, you got to get rid of WhatsApp or you've got to get rid of Instagram. And it's more likely some sort of Chinese wall situation where you end up with a a negotiated exit, continued ownership and control. But, almost like what happened with the banks in the 80s, you kind of got to separate one side of the business from the other. That could be one way that this goes because, it's really hard to kind of break apart given the way that these businesses are built. And
what do you think about